for what Aviv actually is. By seeing a spread of barley growth over 5 weeks difference, you will see a tiny plant versus a much larger plant. This leads me personally to wonder what people are actually looking for in Israel when they're looking for Aviv barley. I don't know what they're looking for. I know that the plant has a specific stage of growth, but it's a very broad, specific stage of growth. So the inconsistencies within the plant at 5 weeks difference in growing are, of course, staggering, to say the least. But the Strong's Hebrew Concordance is what everybody runs to try to figure out what their definition of Aviv is. And the Strong's Hebrew Concordance, what a lot of people don't know is that he uses a lot of Talmud to figure out how to define these words. And the word Aviv is a very colorful word that has multiple meanings. Not in, now, as far as, let's say, when the scripture states that barley was Aviv, who here knows what the city Tel Aviv means in Israel? There's a city called Tel Aviv. That's a city. It literally means hill of spring. So
Hill of spring?
Hill of spring, the season of spring. Because in Hebrew, Aviv means spring. But it could also be used as like a green stage of growth. It could mean life. It could mean tender. It does not say this is a way of determining a year in Scripture. That is an invented assumption.
Yes, Tel Aviv.
Hmm?
Tel Aviv.
Yeah, Tel Aviv, the city, it means hill of spring. And Aviv is also a Jewish baby boy's name. You know, when they name their kids Aviv, it means spring or life. It doesn't mean he's a green piece of barley.
Right.
And now people are going to say, well, you know, Hebrew changes. No, it does not change. Because in the Talmud, Aviv is used where spring should be used. So even way back then, when they're discussing the season of spring, they say Aviv. So all we're really looking at for barley is the understanding that barley is in spring. It's in the spring stage of growth. Now, barley is not the only plant that could be Aviv. You can make any plant Aviv, anything that's in a tender or green stage of growth. Now, we know from Scripture that an offering of wheat or barley, it has to be green. So that's not going to be hard to do in Israel when you've got a 7 weeks difference in growth spanning from south to north. And the reason there's 7 in Israel is because of the mountain regions. Higher elevation, cooler temperature, it doesn't mature as fast. And so, you know, if you're afraid that the Aviv won't be ready for that green sheaf that's offered, then all you got to do is go up north and you'll find plenty of it. So
barley is the harvested in the spring, and then wheat is in the fall.
no, wheat's in the summer.
Wheat in the summer.
But there's also different types of wheats that were harvested in the spring as well. It's not just barley. You can't plant barley in the same field every single year. It's going to ruin the soil. You have to do crop rotation.
Right.
There's winter wheats you can plant in the soil also. But let me get back to my notes here. Let's see here. I wanted to say that God gives the only needed ingredients for a new year in Genesis chapter 1, 14 through 16. And it includes no barley. Aviv just happens to mean spring in Hebrew. I covered that. And like I said, Mr. Strong's, I want to get back to Mr. Strong's. He only uses one part of the Talmud to define what Aviv is. There's several different areas he could have gone to, but he just chose to go with one spot. You know, he did the same thing with Takash, which is the waterproof skin that goes above the tabernacle. He put in there that it's a clean animal. But how does he know that? Because not even the rabbis in the Talmud understood what Takash was. They didn't know. They didn't know what kind of animal it was. They argued amongst themselves. But one rabbi in the Talmud said it was a clean animal. So, guess what Mr. Strong's put in his concordance of definition? It was a kosher animal, clean animal. It's like, how does he know that if we don't even know what kind of animal Takash was? And it's an open debate to this day. So, there's a lot of things that Strong's is going to say, and he's going to give you a very narrow, broad, one-sided definition of a word, when Hebrew is a very colorful language and have multiple meanings, as we're going to discover today about how to determine a new year in Scripture, because there is one word that sticks out that is a great mystery, and it's a homonym homograph word, which can have multiple meanings, and it is the biggest clue we have as to how a new year actually starts. Okay. Let's see here. Now, I want to get back about the Talmud. What's funny about the Talmud is it gives several different understandings specifically about what Aviv barley is. They're not in agreement in the Talmud either. So, the Talmud uses also Aviv interchangeably with the word spring. I talked about that you can see that in Sanhedrin 13b, discussing the season of Nisan, as it is written, observe the month of spring and keep the Pesach. And where it has this written for spring, it has Aviv. So another proof right there in Sanhedrin 13b of the Talmud that Aviv means spring. Aviv cannot be narrowed down to any one very specific phase of plant growth. It's a very broad phase of plant growth. So, now here's another thing. Karaites. You got Nehemiah Gordon, Michael Root, and all these Karaite leading believers. They don't even know that they're following one part of the Talmud, which says to determine a year with barley, when that is also a contested thing in the Talmud, where you've got different rabbis with a whole bunch of different ideas about how to determine a year, and only a few of them say it has anything to do with barley. Okay?
Don't let me tell y'all, but the reason some people say that is because the high priest had to offer it up for the Feast of First Fruits.
Yeah.
So if the barley wasn't a Aviv, he didn't have anything to offer.
Well,
So he had to wait. If he had to wait 2 more weeks or whatever, he had to wait until he had a sheaf offered to wave. The high priest would wave it, and God would accept it. When Yeshua came, he became the Feast of First Fruits. He was the wave offering. So where they get what you're talking about is, if the barley's not a V now, and it takes 2 more weeks, they start the year 2 weeks later when they got something to wave. That's my
2
understanding.
weeks later they start the
Or
year.
whatever. They don't start it until they got something to wave.
Well, you would have to wait for the next new moon, if according to someone's opinion that the barley's not a bee.
Right, and that's why some people do it a month behind us, and, because
Well, tonight I'm going to explain how, no matter what, if you follow the ingredients of the sun, moon, and stars, as Genesis 1 says, you will always have Aviv barley, no matter what, in all of its various stages of plant growth. You will have it no matter what, because, like I said, it's 7 weeks difference. If you have a 13th intercalated month to the Hebrew calendar, and the barley in southern Israel is Dagon, which means it's turned brown, it's dying, it's time to harvest it, no problem. You're going to have green ears in the north that are readily available. So you will have that green offering even if you wait a 13th month and half of the barley is harvested. But I want to show you some really good historical stuff here. But like I was saying earlier, with the Karaites, the Jews of today, they have a lot of invented assumptions about what Aviv barley is. Okay, so and not even the Karaites can agree on what it is. I think what it is it's just some phase in plant growth where there's probably seeds growing up in the stalk. It's still green. It's not Dagon yet, because Dagon is ready to be harvested. It's not ready to be harvested. It's green. So you chop that at some huge stage in plant growth, which measures in 5 weeks, because the important thing here is in the Exodus of Israel, it says all of the barley was destroyed and all the barley was Aviv. Okay? Now we know that means there's got to be at the very least a 5 week span of what Aviv barley is. Does that make sense?
Does that happen because of the northern and southern regions?
Exactly.
It matures, it's planted at the same time?
It's planted at the same time.
But it matures or grows, gets to that point in maturity sooner and later than the others.
They might not plant it at the exact same time, but they harvest it at a 5 weeks difference. So, ancient Egypt, they did things kind of funny. They planted things according to how the Nile River rises and fell, and according to the dog star Sirius. So that's how they knew to plant stuff. That was their calendar in a way of speaking.
Still do it today with a farmer's almanac.
Right. So when they plant their barley in Egypt, and it was all Aviv, but it's all harvested at 5 weeks difference. That means the barley in the south was probably about that tall, and the barley in the north was probably, this tall. That's a huge difference. That means the plant that's this big is Aviv, and so is the plant that's this big is Aviv.
What you're saying, the word Aviv don't mean that it's ready to harvest.
Right.
Then.
That's Dagon.
That's
is
what's
ready to
throwing
harvest.
everybody off.
Mm-hmm.
They say it's got to be ready to harvest so you can wave it before the high priest.
It's not ready to be harvested. It's not wheat that's ready to be harvested.
But it is, they do gather it for the offering, the wave offering. It's not ready to be harvested, they wave that is not ready.
Right, and right here in these papers that Donna brought me, it has the procedure for who sliced the grain, put it in the basket, and took it up there, and it was just one event to offer first fruits. It wasn't like everybody in all of Israel was going at once with Aviv barley. Because if that's the case, first fruits would have to take place in the south at one point, and then 7 weeks later it would have to take place again in the north. So some priest is going to cut some green ears of barley. It could be this tall, it could be this tall. And as long as it's edible in some way, it's got to be edible. And you can eat barley. You can make even if the seeds are just starting to grow in the stalk, you can chop it and make like a gruel out of it. So it's still edible. So what I'm saying is when these guys are out there in Israel with their magnifying glass looking at barley, I don't think they know what they're looking at. Or they're looking at plants that are green. They're this tall, it's Aviv. There is no specific stage of plant growth, not even in the Talmud. And everybody in the Talmud doesn't agree with what Aviv barley technically is. And I don't even think they knew that barley was harvested at 5 weeks different in Egypt. If all of it was Aviv and it was all harvested at separate intervals over a month apart, then Aviv couldn't be anything. You know what I mean?
Right. So it had to be Aviv where? One region, one priest.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're a priest and is the feast of, or it's the
So
first
you're talking
fruits.
about the which temple? Both Solomon's and the tabernacle and Solomon's and Herod's.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I would imagine so. But, I mean, they were commanded to give that offering before they could eat any grain.
Our English thinking, the word Aviv, we want to tell ourselves that word Aviv means that it's ripe. Around here, you don't harvest no crops until they're ripe for you to harvest.
Mm-hmm.
They send bananas over here green
Mm-hmm.
because they have to come so far and move so long, and they start maturing as they're being sent to us. Got what I'm saying? We wouldn't go out there and pick green bananas. We'd wait till they were ready, and then we would pick them. So the word Aviv, in our English mindset, we want to say that means it's ready to eat.
Ready to
What
harvest.
you're saying is the word Aviv is any stage of the growth harvest. It don't have to be ready to eat. And there's 5 weeks between where it's harvested here and where it's harvested there.
Aviv does have to be harvested at some point when the plant is edible. And
Right.
I believe you can find that in Leviticus chapter 2.
But it doesn't have to be fully ripe.
It does not have to be fully ripe. It
That's
doesn't
the
even
whole
have to be
point.
near ripe. You can take a very small, piece of barley that's got seeds just coming up through the stalk, cut it, and make a gruel out of it. And that could be considered an offering. But I wanted to get back to some of the other references of how they used to intercalate a year, at least when the Talmud was being written. It says, okay,
That was during the Babylonian period?
no,
No.
the Talmud wasn't written. Well, the Gemara first started being written around like 100 CE or 120 CE, and then there's the Mishnah, and then the Talmud. All of that was started being written like 300 years or so after the destruction of the temple. There was no Babylonian Talmud while the Jews were living in Babylon.
Along the same period as Constantine.
Kind of, yeah, around that same period. Like the Gemara is probably the oldest writings, and then there's Mishnah, and then there's Talmud. All these books were written after the destruction of the temple. And you can already start to see how they started to forget how the calendar worked based on their disagreements in the Talmud about what could constitute an intercalated year. And of course, in their mindset, the rabbis, they have the right to just change God's law to do anything they want. You have to keep that in mind. But I wanted to tell you a list of what you can read in Sanhedrin 11b, and just go on up through the Talmud to find out how they could change the year. Fruit trees are one way that they would intercalate a 13th month. A late lambing season, roads under construction, diaspora Jews arriving late to Jerusalem, war, and basically just a slew of other reasons that they would intercalate a year. So, now there was one rabbi, Yossi, of the 2nd century CE, who still held on to the claim that intercalation of months should be mathematically calculated based upon the sun's equinox. Okay? And right there, that word equinox that he used was Tekufa. And we're going to talk about that too. Because that word appears in Scripture 4 times. In one of them, it's directly related to the calendar. Twice, it's directly related to the calendar. So, I wanted to talk about a section of the Gemara writings, which were the first writings. Gamaliel, the elder, the one who taught the Apostle Paul, added a 13th month to the calendar, even though the barley and the olives were at this time ready to be harvested and given for tithes. The year was intercalated due to the thinness of the lambs and the tenderness of the birds.
They say intercalated means
They added-
postponed a month.
Yeah, they added a second Adar. Adar 2, 13th month. And right here in the Gemara, Gamaliel adds a 13th month, even though barley is ready to be gathered and tithed, which kind of makes me wonder how that was even possible. But that's what it says, and that's in Sanhedrin 11b. Now, I wanted to talk about, let's see here. Now, let's talk about the Babylonian captivity. Okay, now there are some Babylonian cuneiform tablets that the Babylonians would write on these pieces of clay in Akkadian, which was their language. Very precise dates, events, astronomical phenomena that they were observing, solar eclipses, and plus a lot of different legal documents and things, and these are all preserved, I believe, in the British Museum, and they have been analyzed by some of the top scholars in the world who read Akkadian and can break all this stuff down. Astronomers have looked at it and everything. Now, what's interesting about the Babylonians is that they would never, well, they started their year in the spring, or no, not in the spring, excuse me. They would start their year at the closest new moon to vernal equinox, before the year 499 BCE. That's something that they would do. If it was the new moon that happened a couple of days before a vernal equinox, they would start their year. And their year was very similar, their calendar was very similar to the Hebrew calendar. But in the year 499 BCE onward, the Babylonian calendar did not permit Nisanu, which is the first month, to begin before the vernal equinox. So during the century from 499 to 400 BCE, according to the documented cuneiform tablets, Nisan 1 fell on the day of the vernal equinox 5 times.
It couldn't happen before.
Oh, before 400 BCE. There's a point I'm telling you all about the Babylonians, because there's something really fascinating about this.
Do you know approximately what time period is the Babylonian captivity? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, the Babylonian captivity, this is around the time of the Babylonian captivity, yes.
Which is what years approximately, do you know at all?
Well, 586 BCE is when the temple fell, Jerusalem was destroyed, and they were supposed to be in exile for 70 years. A lot of Jews just stayed in exile, and they were coming back slowly in droves. And I'd like to point out there's something interesting, and this is an invented assumption on my part, and I have no proof of this, but Daniel was chief magi. Okay, he's the top dog, chief magi, in charge, and was second in command under 2 ruling empires. And so I find it interesting that before he was chief magi, and a little bit after, they would start their year before the vernal equinox. But in 499 BCE, that all stopped permanently, and it never continued. And you can also look at the Duberstein, I think it's Parker and Duberstein Babylonian chronology, where they go through the entire list of all the dates, everything that they could write. And it's very fascinating. But getting back to my notes here, let's see, where was I? Okay, Ezra. Ezra returned to Jerusalem in the year 457 BCE. Now, Nehemiah returned in 444 BCE. Keep in mind, we are trying to determine a timeline here of certain things. Now I want to talk about the Elephantine Papyri manuscript, which came from an island in Egypt called Elephantine. There were
Elephantine tablets.
What
was that Elephantine? Was that a set of people?
Well, Elephantine, how do you spell that?
No.
Oh.
No, I'm gonna misspell it anyway. So.
Those are Jews.
The Jews.
These are Jews. If you read in the,
But they're from a region.
well, they're from Israel.
Really?
They escaped Jerusalem before.
What do you call them, Elephantine? I guess.
Well, yeah. That first, here's what happened. Here's what I believe happened. These Jews in particular, and you can find this in the scripture, in the book of Jeremiah. You have this big group of Jews who fled Israel and took Jeremiah with them and went to Egypt. And Jeremiah tried to tell them, God says, don't go to Egypt,
Yeah, that's right.
right?
I know that.
And then God said Nebuchadnezzar is going to invade Egypt, but they said, "Oh no, we're going to Egypt." And a ton of people escaped the Babylonians and went to Egypt, and they stayed at a city called Tahahanes or something. And then what happened after Jerusalem fell? The Babylonians invaded Egypt, but they only made it so far. They didn't really accomplish anything. They kind of got their butts handed to them. They turned around and hightailed it out of Egypt. And I believe that the Jews who were in Egypt, they fled again and went to Elephantine. So in Elephantine
area.
of Egypt.
Ain't that an island?
Hmm?
Ain't that an island?
Yes.
Elephantine is an island
Mhm.
that they all fled to. And what you told me is the Elephantine manuscripts that they found.
Right. These are Elephantine Jewish writings that they found from that time period, which is really fascinating because we can find out exactly how they started the year, started the month, everything, because these documents were dated with 3 dates. And these are not scriptures. This is not Holy Scripture. These are legal contracts, the buying and selling of goods. Ebenezer sold a home to Judah, and so here's the contract. And so there's about 100 documents, and what's great is that we're going to have the Egyptian date, and we're going to have the Persian regnal date, and then we're going to have a Jewish date. Because in ancient times, they would date documents, legal documents, with several different dates. So, and they did that for several reasons. But what's interesting is that these Persian dates, you could reverse engineer these Persian dates based on history and the Egyptian dates, and you can find out what the Julian date was that what these things were written on. So we'll know for sure that some of these documents, this was written in September, 15th, 488 BCE.
I hate to ask the main question, but when did the Julian calendar come into effect?
Well, that was much later.
Do they have to post grudge or?
Julian calendars are more based on astronomy, or specifically the sun.
Don't get off track and stay with you.
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is the reason the Julian calendar is so important to astronomers is because in astronomy everything is based off of the sun, and if we want to go back in time to figure something out, we have to use the Julian calendar. And so what we did, and what my friend Aaron did, and what a whole bunch of other people have already done, is that they went back and they looked at when these Jews started their new year. They never ever started their year until the very first new moon after the vernal equinox. Even if the new moon was 1 day before the vernal equinox, they did not start the year. They added a 13th month. Now, here's where people will say, according to the Babylonian cuneiform tablets, the Jews were just keeping the Babylonian calendar, because the Jews are now calling the first month Nisan, and they're calling it Tishrei and Tammuz and Adar. These are all Babylonian months. These are transliterated Babylonian month names. Here's where Parker and Duberstein's Babylonian chronology comes into play, is because the Babylonians would intercalate the 7th month, which was Elul, on their calendar. Now in Hebrew it's just Elul. They would intercalate they would intercalate the 6th month. Elul is the 6th month. They would add a second 6th month. Now we can compare the Babylonian cuneiform tablets with some of the same years that the Elephantine manuscripts were written, and we can discover that the Elephantine Jews did not intercalate a 6th month. The math doesn't add up astronomically or mathematically to how they started the year based on these dates, the regnal Persian dates, the Egyptian dates, and they all had a certain method of starting their years. So we know, if the Egyptians started their year on this day, and so did the Persians, and we know what methods they used to start the year, then it's easy to determine how the Jews were starting their year, okay? And so when you use an astronomy program, or back in the 50s when they actually were looking at this, they didn't have astronomy programs. Everybody had to do math the real way with about 5,000 pieces of paper where you're writing out mutations and celestial mechanics until you finally figured out what the moon was doing on this Julian date of the Romano-Persian date of this era with this Jewish date. And they all used the crescent new moon to determine the month, and they never once used a new moon before the vernal equinox to start the year.
Never used conjunction either.
They never used conjunction, okay? And so that is a huge breakthrough in calendar science. And now here's another one. Let me see, get back to my notes here. Sorry, folks, I just got it. So basically, I mean, just keep in mind, we're trying to find what kind of system the ancient Jews were using. The ancient Jews.
And what you trying to do, you trying to go back as far as you can.
No, well, not the time of Moses. But yeah, well, in time of Moses too. I'm going to prove to you that they were doing the same thing in the time of Moses that they were doing in elephant time.
Right, because that's when they actually wrote it down.
Mm-hmm. And so yeah, these things are adding up quite nicely with all these ancient dates to how the Jews in Elephantine did it. Now, there's also like the Passover letter, which was written from somebody in Jerusalem to somebody in Elephantine, trying to tell them how to keep Passover, which goes into details about what to do and how to do it. So that's real fascinating. So we know they kept Passover. Ezra and Nehemiah, Esther, all these holy inspired scriptures used transliterated Babylonian month names. Now, don't you find that interesting? That God would allow this abomination in the scriptures? The Babylonian months? Now, Ezra was hand-chosen high priest, straight from God, with a task to put the foundation down for the new temple. He was the high priest. In Babylon, when Ezra left, he left on the first day of the first month. That's what the book of Ezra says. How did Ezra know it was the first day of the first month when he left? If barley is a factor. I don't think it was a factor. He is a high priest. He knows how to keep God's calendar. Okay? And for him to use Babylonian month names tells me that there was no real difference between the Babylonian calendar and the Hebrew calendar. There was until 499 BCE, though. There was a big difference because they would start their year in winter. They would not intercalate the year if the new moon fell after or fell before the equinox. They would just start the year. Okay? So something changed. Something got them to change their mind on how the calendar works. And I believe possibly Daniel, being chief magi, who the magi were the Chaldeans and the magi were the guys who understood celestial mechanics. They knew how to determine solstices, equinoxes, moons, all this stuff. They were so good at astronomy, they could pinpoint in the near future when solar eclipses would happen, what day they would happen on, and what hour of the day. That's very sophisticated mathematics for people living in 500 BC, you know. And so they were not stupid people. Okay, so we talked about all that. Anybody got any questions before we go on to phase 2? Does that make sense?
So, to review a little bit, you said that the Egyptian date, the Jewish date, and the Persian date, they ended up coinciding to create similar. That's what I'm confused with. When you're using all these dates, what are we trying to find?
We're trying to find out how the Jews started their year.
Okay.
And I mean, of course it's gonna start in the
So
spring.
you're saying that the Egyptians had the way they did, the Jews had the way they did, and the Persians had the way they did,
Mhm.
and they were all different.
Right, they were
Okay.
different.
Okay.
And so, basically, you can find out how the Persians kept their calendar, and you right now, there's people who know the Persian calendar inside and out, the ancient Persian calendar. They can tell you what Julian date was during certain events. So, once these events are matched up, and if you know that a Persian date on a Jewish document, it says like I don't know, in the first year of Artaxerxes, this and this happened on this date, etc. That's the regnal date. You can know what the Julian date is of that year, and then you just look at right in the middle, and there's your Jewish date, or your biblical date, or actually it's a transliterated Babylonian date, but they weren't using the Babylonian calendar because on the dates that the Babylonian cuneiform tablets show when the month started, they never intercalated a sixth month. So they were not keeping the exact same calendar method. So that's what this is. I know this is deep. This is an advanced study, and this is why it took me years to finally figure out how all this works. Is that there's a lot of mathematics involved, there's a lot of reading involved, and there's a lot of things that you just have to be aware of. But you can look at these Jewish dates in these elephantine manuscripts, and you can determine how they started the year, when the month happened, how they observed the month, because there's two other dates on the same document. So you can match things up, which people have been matching them up. And there's one thing that stood out that everybody didn't expect, was that they never started a year until after the vernal equinox. And there's something in Scripture about that too, if you're wise enough to see it all the way through, which I'm going to talk about that next. Yes.